In today's video, we're talking time constraints. What's up YouTube? Welcome to the video. My name is Tyler, also known as the Fit Chemist, and I help people take control of their lives by taking control of their fitness and nutrition habits so that ultimately we can lead healthier and happier lives. So if you are new here, welcome. Please consider subscribing. Turn those notification bells on so you don't miss when I post new videos. And if you are returning, welcome back. I'm so glad that you are here. Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues recently published a new article in the Journal of Sports Medicine titled "No Time to Lift: Designing Time-Efficient Training Programs for Strength and Hypertrophy, a Narrative Review." So in today's video, I'm going to go through and highlight some of the key findings and strategies from this paper so that if you do happen to be a very busy individual, you can still lift and get the maximum benefits out of your lifts. Maybe you're a busy college student, or maybe you're working 2 jobs, or better yet, you could be doing both of those. You could be in school and working 2 jobs, or maybe you're a new mom or started a new business, or maybe you just got back from vacation, you don't have a ton of time this week because you're still unpacking and you're readjusting to the work scene. I don't know what the reason may be that's leaving you too little time on your schedule, but I know that these tips will definitely help. Odds are, if you're watching this video, you're probably interested in the video because you don't have a ton of time in the first place, and if that's the case, I understand if you just want to jump ahead to the summary, which is at the end of this video. I've included the chapters feature on YouTube, so you can just scroll along the little timeline across the bottom, see where it says summary, go ahead and click that and skip towards the end. No hard feelings, but if you're interested in going through the details of this paper, I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and as always, the study will be linked down below. But with that, let's get into it. Hope you don't mind, but I've got my computer here to help me with some of the notes as we go through this paper. But to start off, the authors were interested in looking at several key variables. Among them were frequency, volume, training load, exercise selection, muscle action, repetition velocity, and rest periods. And they also talk about stretching and warm-ups towards the end as well. So make sure you stick around to the end of the video. You can see what they say on that. Among these variables, volume and frequency are going to be by far the most important. And one reminder that I want to give everyone is that when it comes to volume, there are 2 ways to define this. One of them is going to be sets times rep times load, and that's going to give you the total amount of volume you lifted. Or we can just generalize this in the second definition and just say the total number of sets per muscle group per week. In this paper, they do use that second definition, so they're looking at the total number of sets. Within this section, they go through a couple of meta-analyses and they come to the conclusion that volume is actually more important than frequency, meaning that if you don't necessarily have time to train something 2 times per week, that getting away with 1 time per week will be okay, so long as your total volume is matched. One thing to note though is that I've previously mentioned on this channel that you should be aiming for a frequency of at least 2 times per week to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. That is still true. However, the reason that people also suggest a higher frequency is because that allows you to accumulate a higher total volume, which is going to lead to better gains in the long run. They also mentioned 2 studies that were looking at untrained individuals, and they wanted to compare the difference between the number of sets when it comes to upper body versus lower body. And what they ended up finding is that when it comes to lower body, the total amount of sets is actually more important. They found that 3 sets is better than 1. However, when they compared this to upper body, they found that 3 sets compared to 1 gave roughly the same result. What does this mean for you? Well, if you're a new trainee and you're going into the gym, you can focus more on accumulating total volume when it comes to your lower body and probably get away with a little bit less volume on upper body. Overall, the authors recommend doing at least 4 sets per muscle group per week, and again, that can be spread out in whatever way you want. If you only have time to go to the gym once or twice per week and you can only hit that muscle group once per week, that is going to be okay. Just keep in mind that total volume is ultimately going to be the driver for those gains. So now that we got volume and frequency out of the way, you might be wondering, Tyler, how hard or how heavy do I still need to lift in order to make those gains in a time crunch? Before we dive into that, I do want to point out that just like volume, there are actually 2 ways to define training load. One of them being is a repetition maximum. So if you see something like a 12 RM, that means a 12 rep maximum, and that would mean that you are choosing a weight at which you would fail at 12 reps. The other way to define training load is going to be percent of your 1 rep max, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It is a percentage of your highest single. So after reading through this section, it seems like this variable has a little bit of give and take to it, because they do note some studies that actually had pretty similar results when people were training with a 15 to 40 RM, or basically in the 15 to 40 rep range, compared to people training in the 6 to 12 RM or 6 to 12 rep range. Interestingly enough, the authors state that if you're working in that 6 to 12 rep range or the 15 to 40 rep range, so long as training effort is matched as well as total volume, you should expect about the same hypertrophy responses. Some people might make the argument that going heavier and doing less reps would actually be better if you don't have as much time, because you're not going to be spending as much time actually doing the lift. However, once you get up to some pretty high percentages of your 1 rep max, you are going to have to spend a longer time resting, which means longer rest periods, and that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later in this video, but that is something that you're going to have to keep in mind. In this section, they also note that if you are training at heavy enough percentages of your 1 rep max, you actually don't need to train to failure. So with all the advice from this section, what I ultimately boiled it down to is that in order to balance the amount of heavy weight versus rest period, I would say you probably want to work in that 6 to 12 rep range. Next up is exercise selection. So if you are in a time crunch, you definitely do not want to prioritize isolation movements, which means you're just working on one specific muscle group, so something like a bicep curl or a lateral raise, and you definitely want to prioritize multi-joint compound movements such as the bench, squat, or deadlift. One thing from this section that I found was particularly interesting was that they mentioned one review that actually detailed that if you're just training solely with compound lifts, there's no additional benefit to doing isolation exercises, so you don't have to worry about hitting some skull crushers or some dumbbell curls at the end of your workout just to get in some extra volume. Those will get taken care of while you're doing the compound movements themselves. One thing you might also consider is what equipment type should you be using, and there's one study they mentioned in this section that actually looked at the difference between barbell and dumbbell benching, and they found that when people were barbell benching, they were able to lift 20% heavier weight, and they also found greater activation in the secondary muscles such as their front delts and their triceps. So to me, that would suggest that you probably want to go with the barbell route, because that is going to give you better gains over the long run if you are in that time crunch. Just because of that one study though, it doesn't mean everybody should be training with a barbell. You should take things into account like your skill level and technique, equipment availability, is there a spotter around, so all of those should factor into your decision. And again, just because that one study suggests that barbell might be better, it might not necessarily be better for you. After they talked about free weights, they went on to look at the effects of training with resistance bands, and what I found was interesting is that there's actually some studies that have demonstrated the same amount of hypertrophy when you're doing resistance band training compared to some of those free weights, at least when it comes to the upper body. This was quite reassuring because I had to do that for several months, or most of you did too, during COVID. One study did find that a barbell squat was better for activation than resistance band squats, and to me that does make a little bit of sense, because with a barbell you can go much heavier and get better activation during that exercise. But since the data isn't 100% conclusive when it comes to resistance bands, I'd say your best bet is to try to get to the gym if you can, but if you can't and you don't have that much time, or maybe the gym is 20 minutes away, a resistance band workout at home is probably going to do the trick. The last thing that they talk about in this section is body weight exercises, and they do mention that this could be a viable option for someone if they are a beginner. However, they do note that it's going to be difficult to add weight each week or add increasing resistance, so that's something to keep in mind if you are considering body weight training. We'll get back into the study in just 1 second, but my question of the day for you guys is, how long do you currently spend in the gym? For me, I spend about 75 to 90 minutes including my warm-up, but I'm curious to hear how much time you guys spend, so let me know down in the comments below. And with that, let's get back into it. Next up is muscle action. And what do we mean when we say muscle action? Well, there are 3 types of muscle movements. So one of them is going to be the eccentric, which is lengthening the muscle. There's going to be a concentric muscle action, which is contracting or shortening the muscle. And then there's going to be an isometric hold, which is essentially keeping the muscle at an equal length. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why the authors included this section in the paper, because most of the time you're going to be doing eccentric and concentric parts of the movements anyways when you're doing the full lift. There might be some specific cases if you're a power lifter or bodybuilder, if you're trying to do specifically eccentric or specifically concentric parts of the movements, but if you're in a time crunch, it's probably not the best idea to focus on doing just one of those, because you can double the bang for your buck if you're doing both of them at the same time. And we know from the previous section that we want to be focusing on multi-joint compound movements, so if you're going to be doing those types of movements, you're probably going to be doing the eccentric and concentric anyways, so I would say this is not something that you definitely need to focus on. Next up is repetition velocity or lifting tempo. One thing I found interesting was that they mentioned one meta-analysis that found no difference in hypertrophy when you're doing a half a second rep compared to an 8-second rep. So that means those super slow reps that you are doing have actually no benefit and they're just wasting your time. There was one study that they mentioned that shows that if you're doing greater than 10-second reps, you are actually doing something inferior for hypertrophy and you're not picking a heavy enough weight to actually elicit that response. The only time that I would suggest doing some of these slower reps is if you don't have access to heavier weights and you need to make the lift more challenging. So that could be a potential way of ensuring progressive overload. So let's say you're lifting with some resistance bands at home. If you go from a 4-second rep to a 5-second rep the following week while using the same weight, that is a form of progress. However, with that being said, if you can get into the gym, I would say great, that's going to be your best option, and then just lift heavy and you're good to go. But if not, and you have to do something like body weight training or resistance band training, that might be a time to include some of this slower rep tempo training. Next up is rest periods. So why are these important? Well, it's going to help our body remove some of the lactic acid buildup, and it's also going to help us replenish ATP and phosphocreatine, both of which are chemicals that are important for muscle contraction. Now, there are studies that have demonstrated an insufficient time of rest between sets can actually lead to a force reduction in those following sets, and as a result can lead to a total decrease in volume. In this section, the authors recommend resting for 1 to 2 minutes if you are a novice to intermediate trainee, and if you're someone who's an advanced trainee, then you can rest somewhere from 2 to 3 minutes. However, both of these are quite long, so how do we get around that and make better use of this time? The first technique that we can utilize is something called a superset, which is doing 2 exercises back to back with little to no rest in between. Supersets can be done with exercises that hit the same muscle group, so something like a barbell bench press followed by chest flies, that would be one example. Or you could do something called antagonistic paired supersets, which is hitting opposing muscle groups, so something like chest and back. So let's say you were to do barbell bench followed by a barbell row, and utilizing these antagonistic paired supersets is actually going to help you maximize some of this time. There have been multiple studies that have shown that if you do utilize this strategy, you can actually reduce the amount of time you work out by 50% while still maintaining the same amount of volume. The next strategy is going to be something called a drop set, which is where you hit a traditional set at your normal weight, and then right after you're going to drop that weight by 20 to 25%, hit another set, and then if you want, you can do that multiple times in a row. And when you're doing a drop set, you should be taking all of those sets to failure. Some of the studies that they highlight in this section mention that there's actually no difference in terms of hypertrophy when you're doing drop sets versus traditional sets with normal rest periods. However, there is a difference when it comes to strength. So traditional sets with normal rest periods are actually going to be better for strength. So if strength is your goal, you probably don't want to be utilizing a ton of drop sets. Most of the studies that they mentioned in this section were done using isolation movements, so again, it's probably not a good idea to be doing drop sets on heavy compound lifts like a barbell back squat. The next strategy is going to be rest pause sets, which means that you still take the normal rest period, however you take smaller rest periods that are pre-planned within the actual set itself. So what that might look like in action is, let's say you want to do a 3x6, so 3 sets of 6 reps to get a total of 18 reps. Instead of doing that in 3 sets, you might try to knock that out in 1 set while utilizing the rest pause technique. And to do that, you might be able to hit 10 reps at a specific weight, rest for 20 seconds, hit 4 reps after that, rest for 20 seconds, and then hit the remaining 4 reps to get to 18 reps. And that's going to be able to be done in a much shorter time than if you were to do the 3 sets of 6 reps. Unlike drop sets and rest pause sets, we're not going to be training to failure, and we also don't require a reduction in training load, which suggests that this strategy might ultimately be better for both strength and hypertrophy. One thing to keep in mind for this particular strategy though is that it might be somewhat difficult for beginner lifters because you are going to be lifting heavy and you're going to be training close to failure, not quite to failure. However, you're still going to be keeping a heavy amount of weight on the bar, unlike in drop sets where you're reducing the amount of weight. So if you're continuing to go heavy while training close to failure, that could potentially increase your risk of injury if you don't have good form already down. So those are all the variables that they were concerned with, and then after that they transitioned into talking about maintaining muscle. And good news for us lifters out there, if we can't make it to the gym for at least 3 weeks, we can still maintain our muscle by doing absolutely nothing. Even better news news is that they detail in this section that it's quite easy to maintain your strength and muscle mass. So they talk about a few studies that are looking at younger adults, and they're actually able to maintain their muscle mass with only 1 session per week. So if life gets in the way, don't worry about losing that muscle mass. If you can still get to the gym 1 time per week, I'd suggest doing a bunch of heavy compound lifts, and you should be good to go in terms of maintaining that strength and muscle mass. As promised earlier, let's now dive into warm-ups and stretching. So in this, they're talking about 2 specific types of warm-ups. One is going to be a general warm-up in which the goal is to just increase your core body temperature. So that's going to be doing something like 5 to 10 or maybe 15 minutes of low intensity steady state. The other option is doing an exercise specific warm-up. So something like doing some light sets of squats before you actually get to your working sets. And the idea here is that you're sort of warming up and activating the muscles that are going to be used once you get to those heavier working sets. The second option might be useful if you're training at loads heavier than 80% of your 1 rep max. However, they do mention some studies in this particular section that say that even this kind of warm-up might not have that many additional benefits. When it comes to stretching, the current scientific literature shows there's no benefit when it comes to increasing performance, and it actually does not reduce your risk of injury or the severity of delayed onset muscle soreness. And in fact, static stretching can actually reduce your strength. They mention 2 studies in this section that found stretching either before or after a lift doesn't do anything to reduce the severity of the delayed onset muscle soreness. So if the goal is time efficiency, we shouldn't be spending that much time focusing on stretching and warm-ups. In fact, we probably shouldn't be doing any of those at all unless the goal is to actually increase flexibility, in which case that is something that you should be doing. So we can go ahead and summarize. I'm going to throw up a screenshot from the paper and also just go through some of the points. So what we want to focus on is prioritizing bilateral multi-joint exercises. We want to perform a minimum of 1 leg pressing exercise like squats, 1 upper body pulling exercise such as pull-ups, and 1 upper body pushing exercise such as the bench press per week. When it comes to training volume is going to be more important than training frequency, and we want to aim for about 4 sets per muscle group per week. We can incorporate strategies such as supersets, drop sets, and rest pause sets to have training time but still maintain that total volume. We should restrict our warm-ups to exercise specific warm-ups if we're even going to do any warm-ups at all, and we should only be stretching if the goal is to increase flexibility. I hope that after watching this video, you now have a better idea of how to be more time efficient with your training. Before I sign off here, I do want to say if you are interested in understanding some more of the principles that go into designing a sound training program, that you can go ahead and check out my series on this. So I'll link that somewhere up here, and I'll put it down in the description box below as well. Or if you're interested in working together with me to come up with a specific workout program for you, that is a service that I offer, so you can go ahead to my website, which will also be linked down below. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments down below, and again, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe, turn those notification bells on, because I post new videos every single Friday, and you do not want to miss when they go live. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.